I'm John Anderson, President of the National Academy of Engineering, and I'm here today with Dr. Frances Arnold, Nobel laureate and member of all three national academies, Engineering, Science, and Medicine. Frances, thank you for being here today.
I'm delighted to be here, John.
Yeah. You've had a great career. I've known you for quite a while, and I'm anxious to hear and let others hear about that career and how it developed. When you were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2018, you were the fifth woman, I think, ever to get the prize in chemistry, right?
That's right.
And the first U.S. woman, if I had that right, right? Okay. So could you tell us a bit about how the work you did that got you the notoriety to get the prize?
Well, in fact, it was notorious because I was an engineer and not a chemist. And I figured out the obvious, which is that evolution is the best engineer on the planet. And that evolution can create highly complex catalysts, the enzymes, and fine-tune them for all sorts of new purposes. And what I did was to figure out how to use that as a forward engineering process. Actually practice evolution in the test tube. Like breeding cats and dogs, you could breed new enzymes.
And you could select the ones, so it's selective breeding in a sense, right?
That's right, it's artificial selection, just like the farmyard, and honestly, just like cats and dogs. We don't understand how the DNA encodes a silky fur or a long tail, but by choosing the parents and who mates with whom and who goes on to do the next generation, we've created all sorts of biological things that wouldn't be here without us. I do the same thing with enzymes.
Well, as a fellow chemical engineer, you made that sound simple, but I know it's not. There's a lot of engineering and science that went into making all this happen and be productive. This is interesting because you were an aeronautical engineer at Princeton, right? And something about you didn't like chemistry at the time, or I'm not sure. And then I knew you when you were a graduate student at Berkeley in chemical engineering and doing work on modeling chromatography and with Harvey Blanche. You had to learn a lot of chemistry in between Princeton and what you did at Berkeley, right?
Well, chemistry was wasted on me when I was an undergraduate. I wasn't mature enough to truly appreciate the science, and so I got a D my freshman year in chemistry and did not progress in that field at the time. But by the time I made it to graduate school, I was ready. I was ready to appreciate how all the materials and chemicals in our world are made, all the things we use in our daily lives. And suddenly chemistry just became so fascinating to me.
You got a D in chemistry, and then you end up winning a Nobel Prize. Now, that should really embolden a lot of people, right? Because it opens the gates and say, if you can be imaginative, creative, work 80 hours a week and you can get it all this done, right?
That's right, and I'm sure my professors were aghast. She got the Nobel Prize?
Well, I just knew your advisor, and he was not aghast. He knew how talented you are. You also won the Draper Prize, which we consider in the United States the top prize for engineering accomplishment and for directed evolution. So directed evolution is a term you coined, I think, didn't you?
Well, I decided I would call my own experiments directed evolution. You could have called it laboratory evolution. You could have called it random mutagenesis over iterative rounds. So there were many different ways of calling it. I think Jerry Joyce actually was the first person to use directed evolution in the context of making new molecules.
I like the term. It's kind of interesting because you think of evolution as random all the time, but it's directed with some randomness. You direct the evolution. I think it's really cool. I really like that. And it's kind of the essence of engineering. You don't have to know everything about it, but you've got to know enough to select.
Well, you have to know where you want to go.
Yes.
Then you have to know how to look for it. because the first law of directed evolution is you get what you screen for, which is not a trivial statement, because if you don't screen, if you don't look in the right way, you'll get something else.
Innovations like this flourish because there have been innovations and advances in other areas, like being able to screen materials, banks, diagnostics, and so on, right? So a lot of that all came together at the same time for you.
Well, of course, that was back in the 80s. It was the time of combinatorial everything, combinatorial materials, combinatorial chemistry. But honestly, evolution is really different. It's not just combinatorial. Because we, the biological world, is the product of evolution, it tells us something about the fitness landscape that we're traversing, the optimization space. And it actually works. Evolution works really well for evolved systems. It doesn't work so well for non-evolved systems, like materials and chemistry.
You sound like a philosopher.
There's a lot of philosophy in this, but there's also a lot of data. So it's a wonderful mixture of philosophy and data.
You know, you're bold and you're adventuresome. And know people that knew you when you were growing up, you had some interesting experiences, right? I remember you telling me when you were in my office many, many years ago, I think you were interviewing for a job or something, that you drove a taxi for a while and you waited on tables and so on before you went to college.
Sure.
You know, talk a little bit about life experiences.
Well, I always had to work for a living. I lived on my own and paid rent for an apartment. And it was really hard to do that working at the pizza parlor. So when I was 17, I lied about my age and got a job at Walt Harper's Attic, the top jazz club in Pittsburgh at the time. Mm-hmm. What a great job that was. I also liked to drive, and I figured, gee, I might as well try the taxi because that earned at least twice as much as the pizza parlor. So I was the first woman yellow cab driver in the city of Pittsburgh in the summer of '73, I think it was.
My guess is you're the only Nobel laureate that was a cab driver.
I don't think so.
You think there's others?
I bet there is.
We can put some money on that. I don't think that's...
But I also drove at Princeton for the Able Cab Company, because once again, you could work in the library for $1.75 an hour or $5 an hour driving a taxi. So
very good. Now, you've changed interests over the years in various ways, but I also noticed when you were an undergraduate, you got interested in solar energy, and this was in the late 70s, and it was a pipe dream back then, when you think about it. The cost, if you look at the costs and so on, but there's been a great transition. Do you still follow solar energy?
Well, first of all great science and engineering starts as a pipe dream.
That is true.
And really, the question is, how long does it take to go through the pipe? So, yes, well, first of all, I was in aerospace engineering at the end of the Vietnam War. Not a good time to go into aerospace. But energy, we had all these energy crises, cars lined up for blocks to get gas, the OPEC situation. So it was clear that we needed alternative sources of energy already then in the mid-70s. So I, instead of going into the aerospace industry, decided I would learn something about solar energy and joined the new national laboratory, the Solar Energy Research Institute in Golden, Colorado.
Is this NREL?
It's now NREL, but then it was President Carter's. Do you know we had a national goal of 20% renewable energy by the year 2000? That was Carter's national goal.
We didn't quite make it, but we're heading there now.
Well, a little bit late, but that's what I wanted to contribute to. So my first job, real job, out of Princeton was at that new national laboratory.
That's something. I didn't know it was called something else before. But now, with some technology advancements, solar cells are quite affordable. And in fact, people in Florida are putting them on their house and selling electricity back. I think you're aware that the Queen Elizabeth Prize in Engineering was given this year to people who worked on solar cells, made something called PERC.
Yes.
And so that must be fulfilling or satisfying to you in a way that you identified some of those things, even though you didn't continue working on it.
I didn't continue, but solar is such a broad field. It's not just the electricity conversion. I was working on passive cooling using solar energy, desiccant cooling, good mechanical engineering problems. Yes. And of course, heating and cooling were big advances at the time.
And now, of course, there's grid issues too, and so on. So, like we say, it's a system, like biological systems. There's systems work here. Right? You were elected to the National Academy of Engineering a couple decades ago, and your father was elected many decades ago, right? He's passed on away, but that must have been very satisfying to have be in the NAE with your father. I'm guessing you were the first father-daughter team, is that right?
John, one of my fondest memories was when I went to Washington to be inducted into the Academy. My father was in the audience, and as I'm walking across the stage, he jumps up, puts his arms out, and says, "That's my daughter."
That's great.
And the whole audience clapped for him.
That's great. Yeah, that's super. He was a nuclear engineer and physicist working at Westinghouse, right?
That's right.
It was Bettis Labs, probably, and
commercial, actually.
Commercial, yeah, and so that must have been really satisfying. To go further with that, this past year we had our first mother-daughter. So, and we have several father-daughters now, but I think you probably were the first, and that's fantastic.
Well, there weren't very many women in the National Academy of Engineering at the time. So
that's right.
It took a while to get those women in there, and
that's
then
right.
fathers
We've done better recently, but it took a long, long time. You're also the presidential appointment to be co-chair of PCAST. President's was a Council on Science and Technology. Can you talk a little bit about your work there with PCAST?
PCAST is a wonderful experience. I've never been an administrator. I've not taken on service roles very much in the university because of various things in my career. But when I got the call in December 2020 to come and serve in the White House for this President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology as co-chair, I was taken aback. I have zero experience in Washington, really hadn't thought deeply about science policy.
That's probably why you were valuable.
I'm not sure why I was valuable, John, but I felt, take yourself back to December 2020. It was the lowest time. We didn't have vaccines. This was the pandemic. My mother had just died in her nursing home. My brother was in the hospital dying at the time that I got a call. Luckily, it was in Arizona, so I could actually go into the hospital and be with him. We were terrified. And it was a very low point. We had just had a new election, and here comes a president-elect who cares about science. We had 4 years, of a White House that really did not show that it cared about science. I just felt that I had to say yes, whether I was qualified or not. And I'm very glad that I did say yes, because it's been an immensely satisfying experience to realize how devoted our civil servants are, people who work in the White House and the executive branch and all the agencies, how important the national academies are to our country. And I just, I feel very proud of what happens in Washington.
Well, we thank you for taking on that too. I know it's a lot of work, and you're still a very active researcher with a lot of responsibility, so thank you for doing that. And I think you can feel good about making a difference, which is, I agree with you in all your statements. You got it all right. What do you see as the challenges now in your role there and in your role as a researcher still? What are some of the technical challenges we're looking at in different areas right now?
John, as co-chair of PCAST, I had some role in choosing what our first efforts would be in, given the president's agenda and what he wanted to accomplish in his administration. Everything from public health to climate change. And we chose to look at wildfires, the technical challenges to fighting wildfires, what science and technology could be brought to bear. We have been looking at maybe forming a national adaptation plan for climate change and understanding the extreme tail risks of climate change in terms of extreme weather. We've been looking at the public health workforce, all these topics that don't touch the chemical engineering that I do in breeding molecules, but are so important to our society and to the health of our country. So I have these two worlds where I come back to California and I can focus on enzymes. I love enzymes. But then when I go home and do my Zoom meetings with the White House, or I go to Washington and I worry about cyber physical resilience of electrical grids, they're very different worlds, but they're tied by the same goals. To use science to do something good for the planet, to do something good for people.
I mean, I would think they're also tied by systems thinking, and thinking of what ifs, and if we do this and that took you through directed evolution. Still, even though you're not an expert in all the aspects of those fields, you still have to think through the problem, right?
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head. The engineering background, the training that I had as an engineer enabled me to identify what are the pieces that need to be put together, how do they fit together in order to solve a very complex problem, and to think of the system. And the system is actually a lot more than the engineering system. Now it includes, oh my goodness, it includes people. That's so complicated.
Well, people have to accept whatever you're trying to do.
That's right.
Innovations don't occur unless the public accepts it. And this is where the social sciences, for instance, have to come in, and humanities to connect. And I always think of, engineering connects with society directly. If you wrote down as you go to work what engineering has done in your life, you'd have hundreds of entries just going to work, probably, right?
It's true.
And of course, if an engineer makes a mistake or something, it's pretty obvious, right? So, and same in your work. So there's a lot at stake, and it's where science hits society is engineering in a lot of ways. So you think you'll stay active in advising the government? After PCAST, if other ways?
I have no idea where the next few years will take me. That's been the story of my life. You just take the newest
That makes
path.
it interesting, yeah.
It definitely makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm just trying to get through this first Biden-Harris administration, get our reports and recommendations to the president.
That's great. So, Francis, we hear a lot of stories about people overcoming obstacles. They're inspirational things, and you've had some ups and downs in your life like everyone else. I think there's a quote of something about my life. I had to get over my life going awry, or something like that. You want to share some things that you had to overcome to reach the lofty heights you have?
I feel that I've been very lucky in many ways, unlucky in some other ones. And that particular quote came not long after the death of my son, my 20-year-old son, which really threw me for a loop. And I think that there are ways to respond to adversity that are not helpful. But I've been gifted with a sense of positivity and gratitude, I should say. Gratitude that I have been able to experience so many things and be here to talk about it and share those experiences with others. I have two wonderful sons who are still living, and we miss William quite a bit, but I am now a grandmother. So good things happen
Congratulations.
after the bad things.
Yes. And so there's some messages there for young people who everybody faces adversity one time or another, and they just, your message would be?
Be grateful for what you have and live through the bad times because good times will come. I believe that.
I like that. Be grateful for what you have, but tomorrow will be brighter.
And also, I think it's important to be kind to others because you don't know what they're going through. Mm-hmm. And if you can help others get through those difficult times, it'll come back to you. Now that I'm in the later stages of my career, I am very grateful for the kindnesses that many people showed to me during my career.
And then you can repay, in a sense.
And then I'm very glad to repay for the next generation.
Well, I know I met one of your former PhDs who's, I think at the University of Illinois, and he's doing very well there. So some very grateful students who've worked under you and postdocs and certainly undergraduates as well, and colleagues. So that is good. You've been at Caltech your whole career, your professional career after school, right?
That's right.
And
37 years now.
And you clearly like it.
Well, I was offered the ability to move elsewhere, and I said, why would I want to do that? I'd actually have to work for a living if I moved somewhere else. It's almost like not working to be here because the students are so bright, and they love engineering. They love science. They're here because they love it, and they just want you to help them love it and move on to do it on their own.
Do the students here get some appreciable amounts of exposure to social situations, social sciences, and humanities as well?
No. Caltech is not known for that. But luckily, most of our students are very well-rounded people. And they enjoy each other's company, and they learn all these other things on their own.
Well, there have been a lot of Caltech graduates who are in leadership positions. You don't get there unless you've mastered some things in personal relationships and so on. So that's good. You have advice for the national academies. You're giving advice to the government now, but how about to the National Academy of Engineering? You get advice that I could take back to my council, for instance, or whatever. What would
Keep doing what you're doing. It is so important. Without the national academies, all the national academies, PCAST would have an extremely difficult time just providing seasoned advice to the president. The role of the national academies as independent arbiters of what's worth doing and what's not has very high credibility in Washington, the ability to think about problems, but also the wonderful people who work there. Mm-hmm. PCAST was staffed with people who were trained at the national.
Yeah, from the public.
That's right.
Policy and government affairs, yeah.
Yes, and this is what I mean. The people who come through the national academies, the people who are trained there, the people who are in the agencies, they're devoted to helping this country move forward using science and technology.
Well, it's heartening to see an engineer as a co-chair and then an engineer as the presidential advisor, right?
That's right, Arthi Prabhakar.
Prabhakar, yes, an NE member. And
Yay women, the three co-chairs are female and
Maria
two are
Zuber,
engineers.
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is. You made your success in the Draper Prize, Nobel Prize, all these awards on a field that was so different from your PhD thesis. You started out and did something totally new.
Well, my PhD thesis was totally different from what I did as an undergraduate.
Yeah. So you had these
I made
steps.
changes all the way through because the world was changing. And biotechnology was not even a thing when I was an undergraduate. But by the time I became a graduate student at Berkeley, this whole new industry of recombinant DNA was exploding.
Did Amgen and Biogen, all those companies started?
How exciting. I said, this is the world I want to engineer. And so I was able to pivot to learn some chemistry finally. I finally took chemistry courses as a 25-year-old. Then I loved it. I took biochemistry. I studied molecular evolution. And I realized I could still learn at that advanced age and do completely new things. And honestly, John, I've done that ever since. And now we use AI, we use all sorts of modern tools that didn't exist when I was a student. I love it. I love learning new things and changing the way that I think on a regular basis.
Fantastic attitude. Fantastic. There's been much discussion about generative AI. Do you see generative AI as being useful in your research work?
We're working on it. In fact, machine learning has already played a big role, but the generative part is incredibly fascinating because you think of DNA, it's a language. You know, it's a music, it's an art form, but it's a language, and we can write new DNA. This was what evolution was all about, was composing new DNA. That's what evolution does. But now we can use it with AI. We can learn what is the language of life and create new proteins, new therapeutics, new catalysts using these modern tools.
So you see a positive role for these things like large language models and chat GPT and all that. You see a role for that in your research.
We're doing the chat GTP of proteins.
We're
generating new proteins using these models.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
This is a very exciting future. Of course, there's worries as well, because if you can create new proteins, new viruses, new life forms, there'll always be somebody who does something nefarious with it. So we have to learn, how do you build these powerful tools with the appropriate guardrails to make sure that the good far outweighs any of the negatives.
Maybe we can learn something from the movie Oppenheimer, because that was kind of the situation there where nuclear had all that potential and then got buried in the negatives.
But isn't that the life of the engineer, right? We put in place powerful new technologies, and we have to weigh the good and the bad.
Well, we have to also try to avoid unintended consequences. You can't always do that, but you can sometimes anticipate what they might be, and as you say, put in guardrails. That's good to hear. Thank you. So you know that we have this great program, Frontiers of Engineering. It's now called the Granger Foundation Frontiers of Engineering. It's been in existence since about 1995 or 96. I understand you were one of the early participants. Can you tell us about it?
I'll never forget that. In fact, it's an interesting story. I believe I was the very first speaker in the very first Frontiers of Engineering. And for that, I had to write a little paper, which I wrote on directed evolution. And it turns out that paper was pointed to by the Nobel Committee as one of the first descriptions of this whole process of evolution.
Wonderful. And that is, Frontiers of Engineering has been, and it still is, probably our finest program, especially in mentoring young people or helping young people make connections and move on. And to know that you were the first speaker, that sets it up. We start recruiting people for it. They can say, look what happened. You're the first speaker and now Nobel Prize, right?
But I love that idea that people from very different disciplines got together and shared their ideas. I thought that was extremely exciting, and I made friends at that early meeting that I kept as colleagues and friends throughout my career.
Excellent, excellent. So Frances, you also have you've dabbled in acting. I understand you appeared in the an episode of the Big Bang Theory. You want to tell us how you got into that and how you felt about that?
Oh, John, I wasted a perfectly good morning going down and filming on the Big Bang Theory, where I played myself. You know, I have a SAG-AFTRA contract to play myself. The good news is I have that contract. The bad news is that the show is over. Do you ever watch the Big Bang Theory?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I have.
I hadn't seen it before. But even though it's about nerds at Caltech, who go from being endearing graduate students to being annoying professors.
Sheldon and company.
Right. And they're annoying professors lobbying for Nobel Prizes. So I was asked to come down and film this episode about them lobbying the Nobel laureates, and they actually got me, George Smoot, and Kip Thorne to spend a morning at Warner Brothers Studios.
You were all there.
We were all there, and it was great. It was really
Must have been
a lot of fun.
And fun.
And do you know I was the only woman in the entire history of the show to play herself? They had lots of cameos from William Shatner and Hawkins, but they never had a woman, and I was the only one.
Did Sheldon give you a hard time?
No, we gave Sheldon a hard time. He flubbed his lines multiple times. And Kip Thorne tried to explain it to him, the supersymmetry of the universe, and he goes, "Let me out of here."
Fantastic. You have any idea of when you're going to start writing your memoirs?
Oh, please have.
Some of us would like to know what went on back then.
Oh my! I think I'd have to leave that secret for 50 years.
No, I think it would be fascinating to have that. And those of us have known you and seen you progress through the years, just really proud of you. We are all proud of you, and you carry the torch for engineering. I hope you keep doing that for us.
Well, I couldn't be more proud of being an engineer. I always had a great job.
Yes.